The 18 Strong Podcast, episode number 344 with Casey Cox, co-founder of Sports Science Solutions and director of instruction at Old Warson Country Club. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 18 Strong Podcast. Today I have a very special guest, good friend of mine, Casey Cox from Sports Science Solutions. And Casey, welcome to the 18 Strong Podcast, buddy.
Thanks for having me. Good to be in the studio.
Yeah, right? First time we've done the actual in-person, so we'll see how this goes. We've got some official video equipment set up, so you guys will be able to see this on YouTube. And excited to do this, buddy. It's been a long time coming.
No, very cool. I'm glad we're doing it. So
one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is, first of all, we work very closely together. We have a chance to work with golfers here in the gym. You're working with them on their golf, and I get to work with them from the fitness side, and we're going to talk a little bit how we collaborate with that. But really, I want to dig into your background because I feel like you're a golf professional, but you've got this secret underground layer of this institute where you are a biomechanist and you're doing so much more than just giving golf lessons. And I think that many people haven't seen the expansive knowledge that you're developing kind of behind the scenes and how that's really impacting how you work with your golfers and then ultimately what we end up doing together.
For sure. No, I think it's we're in a brave new world when it comes to this stuff. I think the sciences are so new, biomechanics being really a combination of physics and kinesiology. I think it's a new science in the sense that there's just not a lot of people studying it. There's not a lot of practical application that's been gleaned from it yet. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and I think certainly I'm an incredibly curious person who loves to learn, and so I've found a lot of my curiosities being well piqued in that environment, and I think that it's exciting to be able to not only apply these things in golf but to reach out into these other sports.
There's so much technology at our fingertips now, and you use a lot of it in your work with golfers, but also other sports. I'd like to dig in just to your background a little bit. I know you come from a hockey background, a golf background, but how did you get into the world of not just golf instruction, but even the whole biomechanics piece of it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think all of this comes back. I sustained some pretty significant injuries playing hockey in college. I was a goalie. I think most goalies at play to that level suffer from certain ailments. And I think we see the same thing in golf too, right? I think you see a lot of back issues and these things. I always describe them as common but not necessary. When I got out of school after playing hockey in college, I was a golf professional and got into the business side of things. Took a job in Florida in 2014, moved down there, and was immersed into more of that world. I started meeting instructors, and at the time I wouldn't even say I was an instructor. I had taught, but I was not a golf instructor per se. Through that process, though, really started to gain more curiosity into this. Started to see some of the technology that was being developed. FlightScope and TrackMan were new at the time. K-Motion was just coming out with the K-Vest, or it had been out, but they were really starting to make some good use of it. And so my curiosity started being piqued by these things, and I started playing with these technologies and learning that there was this whole underlying world to what we were seeing here, and there was a whole different way to coach and teach and understand what was happening. And the more I got into that, the more I found that there was an efficiency that was there that didn't exist, I would say, in the things that I was trying to do previous. And it just kept driving me down that road. In the PGA show in 2015, I met with the folks from K-Motion and just kind of threw out the idea. It was like, hey, this stuff's fascinating what you guys are doing in golf. Have you thought about doing it in other sports? And at the time, they expressed interest in wanting to potentially move in other directions. They just hadn't. And I said, crazy idea. If I quit my job and start a sports institute, would you support us from the technology side of things, and would you help us get into those areas? And I said yes. So I quit my job that I had worked my entire career for at that point, and moved back up to New England and started the institute. And that was really the genesis of it. I would say, I had an internal curiosity to figure out why back issues were existing in golf, and more importantly, why would these things happen in hockey? Why were hockey players blowing out their hips? Why were goalies having issues? And I thought I could use this technology to glean some light into that. And so that was really the genesis. That's how it all started.
Real quick, if you could enlighten people what the K-Motion vest, that whole system is, in case they don't know.
Yeah, so I would base it's a set of sensors that you strap onto the body that allows you to measure force in 3 dimensions, which means you're able to see how force is being produced by the body, and then what's happening with that force after it's produced, and how somebody's brain is dealing with all these forces. And it's exceptionally powerful equipment when you can learn what an athlete's doing, what I describe as in the wild. So, getting a really honest look at what this athlete's doing while they're shooting a puck or hitting a golf ball or any of these other things. So the K-Motion system, again, allows us to put sensors in the body and get information, call it an X-ray machine or an MRI machine for motion. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really describes all the underlying things that are going on that we can't necessarily see with the naked eye. And in the world of hockey, where you're dealing with people that are wearing equipment, it's very hard to actually track the body visually and see what's going on. So the 3D allows us to get beneath the surface and understand not just how the body's moving, but why the body's moving, and that's really where the forces come in.
When you started the Institute, what did that look like at first? Was it golf, hockey, a little bit of both? And were you going out to rinks and evaluating? Were you bringing people into your facility? What did that look like?
Yeah, so pretty modest beginnings. I was still teaching golf. I mean, I've always been involved in golf instruction, and so that's always been an avenue that we're able to use in the research world, whether it's with new technology or whatever it is. When we moved back, the Institute, the start of that really was about getting on the ice and starting to play with some of this stuff. I mean, we were looking at organizations, and we had some colleges and some junior teams and stuff like that were interested in doing research. So that's what we did. We got on the ice with these systems, strapped them on, having no idea what we were going to look at or what we were going to find. Looking for patterns, just pulling up raw data and biomechanical graphs and saying, what do you see? Starting with the most basic things. What does it look like when someone skates forward? When we've expanded on that to the point where we're pretty much mapping everything that happens in a hockey rink now, and so it's exciting. I think it's allowed us to learn a lot, but it's also allowed us to understand things that we thought we understood, maybe didn't. Mm-hmm. And again, this is stuff that we've seen in golf. So all this technology came about. We've seen how all of that plays out. We've seen how, a launch monitor allows us to understand effects. We see how 3D allows us to understand the body. So, these things just allow us to get a more objective look at the athlete. I stop rendering opinion at that point, and I can just look at data and make educated decisions based on my knowledge and background and what I'm seeing in the data. And at that point, again, we're being much more surgical and pointed with athletes, and we don't have to guess. We don't have to wonder why. We just get right down to it.
How long did it take you guys to start figuring out and kind of seeing some of those patterns, golf-wise, hockey-wise? And, I know you've told me, you guys have so much data that you've collected that you had to, looking through spreadsheets, going through equations. I mean, what did that process look like? And who else is involved with you? I know there's a couple in the Institute. And, how did you start to then visualize and put these things together? Okay, this is important, this is important. These are kind of some of the things that nobody's talking about, but this looks like it's a big deal.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess we went into this with the idea, the goal that we were going to try to figure out injury prevention, right? Or we're going to at least try to figure out what was existing in the movement of the pelvis, specifically in hockey players, that was leading to the dysfunction and injury in the hips. So we knew that's what we wanted to learn. I guess when we got on the ice, and it's hilarious. To look back, I wish we had pictures and videos of this. It would be hilarious because at the time that we were gathering this data, nobody had seen this data before. Mm-hmm. So it was literally me sitting in front of a computer looking at a spreadsheet for hours. I would sit there for 5 or 6 hours staring at this information, trying to understand what I was looking at. We have a gentleman who was a co-founder of K-Motion. His name's Eric Herter, and he was the original technology developer. He was the one that wrote all the code for K-Motion. And he came on board with our institute and started to help us put these pieces together. And it it was a year of me staring at computer screens, just blindly trying to figure out what I was looking at. I mean, the data capturing was pulling about 3 million data points per second.
Whoa.
And again, you look at a 10-second capture of a movement, and all of a sudden you pull up a raw data sheet that's got 30 million numbers on it and no organization. So you're starting from a really complex place where, yeah, the opportunity to gather the data was there, but there was no way to disseminate it. It took, years of work from myself and from other people and to really make sense of some of this stuff, which is exactly what happened in golf. I mean, it took them almost 10 years to build the original K-Motion golf unit because it was the same thing. Mm-hmm. Like, I gather all this data, and what do we do with it? We've got to make use of it. So the hardware was there, but the software wasn't. And that's a lot of the pieces we had to put together. But it was, I wish I could say it was some magical moment that it all came together, but it was just months of sitting there staring at stuff, trying to figure it out, sending information back to Eric, hey, can we try to learn this? And we need to pull it out of the data. And eventually, over time, we started to automate this stuff. But it was hard. It was challenging. And I think one of the hardest things was, you have a question on something, or I think I see something, or I think I'm learning something, and who do I talk to about it? It was a pretty lonely process for a while. And it still is in a lot of ways because there's just not a lot of people doing this type of stuff. It's definitely grown in the golf world. But you start looking at these other sports, and it's still a pretty lonely world out there and trying to peel apart these things.
Yeah, I know that you've connected and worked with some of the other bigger players in the industry. I know you know the TPI guys very well, and who else have you kind of collaborated with to help navigate these waters? Like, because like you said, when you're the first ones out there looking at this data that you have no idea yet what it's going to end up being. Who else was in there with you guys or helping you guys, or who else did you learn from and collaborate with?
Early on, we used Eric Kaplan was a guy that we used from Axis Golf, who again was very biomechanically focused in the golf world. I know he and I both done a lot of research with Allison TG, who again has had so much to do with defining kinesiology in the golf swing. So again, we built off a lot of those principles. Eric was actually on site for a lot of our early research. He'd fly up to Boston, and he brought his wife up, who was a doctor in chiropractics. And we started using anybody we could who had knowledge that could lend some sort of wisdom to what we were doing. We started working with a gentleman named Jeff Eckhouse up in Portland, who became our director of performance. And Jeff really, his background is in PRI, which is the Postural Restoration Institute. That's an incredibly deep dive into how the brain controls the body and how all of the things that we experience come together. And so we started using Jeff, as sort of that lens to get us some really deep information on what we were seeing from a body standpoint. But it took a village eventually. It was a lot of people, it was conversations with Lance at TPI, and it was Eric, and all these people contributed into this process. And, eventually we wrapped our arms around what does a skating stride look like in 3D, and what do these graphs look like? And we started to create some distinctions between, what's a junior kid look like versus what a college kid looks like versus what the pros look like. And we started to build out this biomechanical spectrum. And we were able to start putting people on that spectrum and understanding what their strengths and weaknesses were, where they were, prone to injury. We started doing a lot of cool studies once we had that foundation in place, and we were able to start to see these things and draw an incredible amount of correlations to injuries, both prevention as well as identification before athletes necessarily knew that they were hurt.
Yeah, we've had a couple conversations where you're talking about going up and you'll do some testing on athletes, a lot of hockey players, obviously, golfers, and you'll do some screenings and see, like, for instance, a younger hockey player that showed like some different things that you're like, we haven't seen this in a junior level hockey player, and shows just like him moving at the level of an NHL player, but also on the other side of the spectrum, like seeing different weaknesses in guys in the NHL and saying like, hey, if we don't fix this is going to cause some serious problems.
Yeah, I was shocked, just to start with the NHL guys, I was shocked when we started looking at their structures, how many of them were, number one, hurt when we were looking at them, and number two, just really lacked movement quality. And again, these are people that are training with the best trainers in the world. They've got access to the best doctors in the world. But the patterns that are built into their brains are off, and it's exceptionally hard to see in real time. I mean, you can't tell what the pelvis is doing underneath their hockey pants, and now we can. Measuring these things, we can see exactly what's going on, and now it's blatantly obvious why these players are blowing out their hips. And when we see these things, we're able to intervene in a very meaningful way. We can talk to the doctors and the strength and conditioning coaches. They can make adjustments in real time to what they're training, and they can bring balance to the system in the body that now all of a sudden they're able to prevent these things from becoming issues. All the way up to athletes that are being told that they need surgery. We've had athletes coming into our institute that have been told by 5 different physicians they need surgery, and they come to see us and they don't. I mean, surgery is an option. You can do that.
It's always an option, right?
It's always an option. If you go to a car salesman, they're going to sell you a car. You go to see a surgeon, he's probably going to recommend surgery. And it's not wrong. I'm not gonna say it's wrong, but it's just not always necessary either. And I think it's been the reflex, right, that we have to go repair these things. But even going in and surgically repairing something isn't solving the issue as to why it happened, right? There's an issue with the way the brain is choosing to move. It's choosing the wrong muscles. It's choosing the wrong pattern, and we can change that, right? But going and doing surgery to fix the issue that caused is only going to do exactly that. It's going to fix that issue,
right,
but it's not going to change the pattern in the brain. And that athlete is just as likely to continue to re-injure these things. I mean, Tiger is the best example of that in the world of golf. He had inefficiencies in his downswing. Now, obviously, he overcame those with compensations that, he described as his magic move. But his magic move ultimately, while it was extremely functional, had detriments to the knee and the back, and you can't avoid that. And I think, again, even at the highest levels, I assumed going into that type of research that we were going to see incredible mechanics and we were going to see flawless movement, and that's not what we saw. We saw a lot of broken down athletes. We saw a lot of athletes who had gone through years of compensation and were doing everything they could, whether it was getting injections or all of this physical therapy. All of this stuff was just trying to keep them healthy, but none of it was addressing the reason why they were getting hurt. And I think that's what the technology allowed us to go in and do, is understand, why is this athlete getting injured? And when we can intervene on that level, now all of a sudden we can take all of this other stuff away. They don't need injections, and they don't need, obviously at some level they would, but I would say the vast majority of these athletes were being misdiagnosed and mistreated because of a lack of understanding as to what was actually causing these issues. And I think that's the biggest thing that we glean from the technology that we have.
So let's shift over to a little bit more of the golf world. And now when you're working with your golfers, I had the opportunity to take a lesson with you last week, so I'm speaking from experience here too. But you have several different pieces of tech. Obviously, there's so much technology available now. What are the most important pieces that you use when you're doing an evaluation? You're looking at people, and then is there like a hierarchy of what you're looking at first, or kind of what are the big rocks that you're looking at when somebody comes in to move? And let's say it's either a PGA Tour golfer or it's just a hack like myself.
I don't think my assessment doesn't change. I could be dealing with a brand new golfer, so I guess a little different. But a weekend warrior versus a tour player, I'm going to assess them the same way. So the information I'm looking for really falls into 3 categories, right? One is the ball and club dynamics, right? So TrackMan or FlightScope or any of these launch monitors is going to give you the evidence of what happened from the physics of club and ball interaction, right? Very important. We need to understand what happened at the end of the day. But again, I would describe this entire process, and I look at movement as a train, right? I describe it as a long train. Okay, when we look at using technologies, what we're doing is we're taking a snapshot basically of the 3 phases of a train. We're looking at the beginning of it, we're looking at the middle section, and then we're looking at the end of the train. Well, the end of the train is just that. At the TrackMan data, the FlightScope data, all that stuff is end of the train. It's what happened. It was the result of all of the other movement. So we want to understand what that is, because that's the output, right? Ultimately, when I'm looking at a golfer and I need to see that, their low point or their club path or whatever we're trying to change, right? We need to look at that and see what the evidence at the end of the day is happening, because that's important. That's the end of the train, right? The middle of the train is more of the, I would say, you're getting into more of the 3D, understanding how the body is interacting with itself, understanding how force is traveling through the body and how the brain is handling all of these things and what types of patterns the brain is going to create. That's more the middle of the train. And then we look at ground reaction data. So any type of force plates and things like that we would use. And again, there's a lot of different technologies that fall into those three categories. What technology you choose to use, I think, is somewhat subjective to the person. But I think the combination of having launch monitor data that tells you the evidence, you have 3D data that tells you how the body was dealing with all the forces, and you have ground reaction force that tells you how people are generally creating this force and transferring it. And you have the trifecta there, and you understand at that point, when you have those three pieces of information, you know exactly what happened. There are no more questions. And once you've seen enough of this, I mean, I can look at, generally one or two pieces of those information, have a pretty good idea. You can look at movement and look at launch monitor data and pretty well know what's going on. But again, when I'm assessing people, I'm really trying not to render opinion. So
Sure.
The idea of going through the process, putting people on these pieces of equipment, people like it because it's engaging, but it's not for the sake of cool technology. That's not why it's there. It's information for me. And all the information that comes from that is information that I would then use to make a determination as to what the best course of action with this person is. And again, I think you gather data, and then for me, I look at it in a framework of, there's three different pillars that I try to assess with somebody outside of their mechanics or movement patterns, right? It's, what is your background in sports? What's your predisposition in terms of your brain? What is your brain's tendency and autopilot already doing for you? Because that tells us a lot about, what sort of shortcuts I can take or what type of bridges I can build athletically to these people. So that's really important. I also want to understand, what type of work this person is willing to put in. That's the ultimate variable. If this person is not wanting to do a ton of work, that's going to tell me something. If this person's like, no, I'm gung-ho, I'll work on this every day. I work out 5 days a week. Like, okay, we've got a whole different set of systems we can work with here. So that's a really important factor. And then based on that information, you got to determine whether or not you want to change what you're seeing or you want to manage it. And I think that's where the conversation for me goes with an athlete. Once we look at the data and say, okay, this is where you are. Okay, you're telling me this is where you want to be. I can tell you based on where you are and where you want to be, what the pathway is going to be to either use the same structure you're using, right? So not make wholesale changes necessarily, but modify the patterns that you're using to make best do with what we are, right? That would be the least invasive. Or we're just going to blow this thing up and start from scratch. And so, again, for me, understanding whether or not we're going to manage something or change something, as a coach, that's a huge, huge variable.
Yep.
And in order to determine that, you ask somebody, well, do you want to manage or change it? Oh, I want to change it. Okay, well, let's talk about what the process of change looks like. I mean, it's a very, very deep process. And I think when you can give people an honest assessment like that, they can start to make their decisions. And now, not creating any false pretense, not creating any false expectations. Like, this is the process. If you want to go through this process, this is what it looks like. You need to put in X amount of work to see this. If you want to do this, this is what it looks like. And again, I think based on the data we gather and just talking to people and making those simple assessments from a coaching standpoint, now all of a sudden you're setting up a blueprint for this person to make some real progress. I mean, you've set some real expectations, and this person knows what they need to be doing. And I think when you can create that type of framework, now you've really leveraged the information for good use, right? You're not just looking at all this information and be like, okay, I'm going to change your world now. It's not the way it works. And I think that a lot of people, especially see, younger professionals getting involved with technology, and they want to take the information they're gathering and disseminate it all, right? And I can remember standing there with Flight Scope and TrackMan early on and being like, all right, we're going to work on your spin axis and we're going to do all this stuff. And you start just regurgitating all this information to these people, and it's like, it's not helping them, it's not making them better. So the use of technology is really about how you leverage that as a coach. And as much as we are, geared to sharing all that information, it's not for the athlete, it's for the coach. Same way you go to a doctor and you get an MRI done, like, the doctor's not going to sit there and describe to you everything on the MRI. You're going to get the information that is necessary to you. And it's what I try to do with athletes. It doesn't need to be overly complicated. In fact, I think the more information you gather as a coach and the better job you do creating a framework, the simpler the message at the end of the day should be. And that's what technology should be used to do. It should be used to simplify the message to students and streamline the process of them getting better.
That's right where I wanted to go with this. First of all, I think it's really important, the point that you made, that first the person has to determine how much effort they are willing and can put in, right? Like, it's one thing if you want to completely overhaul your swing, but if you're running a Fortune 500 company and you have no time during the day, well, then you just don't have the time to do that, right? You may not have the willingness to get in and put into practice and do everything that you need. So first, determining, okay, what's my realistic goal here? But then, once you have all this data, like you said, like what is important for the golfer to truly understand? Like, are there any certain fundamentals that you say, okay, like body-wise and club and ball-wise, here's a couple things that I need you to understand in order to even start this process, whether that's an overhaul or that's just we're working on fixing a few things?
I think, the big principle that I tend to work towards and solve first and foremost is balance. I think that and again, I don't want to get too deep on the neuropsychology side, but when your body and your brain senses in a level of imbalance, it is going to compensate and start to do a lot of things that we don't necessarily want to see. So if I'm seeing an athlete and a golfer who is struggling with balance, I know that we're going to be dealing with a level of randomness when it comes to their movement patterns. So again, if somebody and everybody comes to me looking for consistency, right? That's the one thing everybody's like, I need to be more consistent. So, okay. So, the number one thing when it comes to consistency is people aren't balanced. And there's a million reasons why the body loses balance in a complex movement like golf. But ultimately, if a player is not establishing and maintaining balance throughout a golf swing, they are going to be subjected to a tremendous amount of variation and change. And I think that, again, whether I'm teaching somebody to manage themselves or change themselves, this idea of creating balance is non-negotiable. It's something that it absolutely has to happen. So in one way or another, that's the first thing that I'll address with people. And that may look like a lot of different things, right? That conversation may look like a lot of different things, but ultimately this underlying idea, when I'm looking at somebody, the first thing that I'm trying to establish is, do they have balance? If they have balance, we can start to move on to some of these other checkpoints. But until you have balance, there is going to be an underlying randomness to the movement pattern, and that compensation doesn't allow you to make meaningful gains in other ways. And I think especially for people that don't play the sport consistently, right? The people that can come out and play 5 days a week and hit a bunch of balls, you're going to get away with a lot more because you're going to develop timing. Again, it doesn't mean you can't hit a golf ball without balance or some of these things, but it requires another level of athleticism and timing. And most of us don't have the time and energy to dedicate to that. And ultimately, even if you do, those have consequences physically, right? See Tiger Woods. Okay, Tiger practiced longer and harder than anybody to get the timing and the control of his golf swing. But again, he still had underlying biomechanics that didn't jive. And so that led to a series of injuries. And so, yeah, you can get the performance, but you can't avoid the injury side of it. And that's where, again, to me, this idea that, my number one goal with people is to allow them to play golf more frequently and for a longer period of time. Mm-hmm. And that's not going to happen if they're hurting themselves.
Yeah.
So when it comes to balance, typically when I address balance with somebody, we're getting into the conversation of posture and movement, and that in itself starts to relieve a lot of these aches and pains. And that oftentimes is enough of the lighting of the fire for people to want to do more. But again, as much as I like the world of performance, I continually find myself falling into the world of injury prevention and dealing with that, whether it's golf or hockey or other sports. Because again, performance is fun and everybody wants performance, but ultimately when I get that guy in who wants to play more consistently, it's 10 minutes into the conversation and we're talking about his knee pain and his back pain and all these other things start to creep to the surface. It's like, these are bigger issues, right? Mm-hmm. And these are also coming about as symptoms of the poor movement mechanics. So the same thing that's going to help this person perform more consistently and play better and all the things that ultimately they want to do is also directly tied to them feeling better and not hurting themselves. So again, I think my lens has always deviated more in that direction. I think it comes back to the injuries that I sustained and the whole reason why I got into this, which was trying to help people enjoy, sports via not getting hurt. And I think, again, for me, it always seems like it comes back to that.
Well, obviously you're speaking my language with my background in PT. I got into that primarily because I was exposed to physical therapy after an injury and playing soccer. And so, that's always kind of my focus. And really, I always say that's my main intent when I'm working with anybody in the gym. It's not to increase your club head speed. It's not to lower your handicap. It's, first of all, just to make sure that you continue to play or you get rid of your pain or whatnot. But what I thought was really interesting the first time that you and I worked together, and we had a session probably close to a year ago and then just recently last week. But the first time that you ever had me strapped up to the K motion, you were just kind of setting up in the corner, weren't even looking at me hitting balls or anything, and all I had on was the K motion. I don't even know if we had the TrackMan going or not. But I'm hitting a couple balls. You're like, just keep hitting. We're going to get some data. Didn't look at me at all. And then you're like, okay, I think I got enough swings. And you just look through it and you're like, hey, does your back ever hurt when you play golf? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Like, you weren't even looking at my mechanics, but you were able to diagnose based on the things that you saw via the 3D capture. And that's when it like hit my brain like, oh my gosh, like this is something that just being able to diagnose with that, with a couple little movement tweaks, no matter how many YouTube videos somebody's going to watch to try to fix their swing, shifting their pressure or, externally rotating, whatever they're learning, without seeing without being diagnosed and seeing some of these minute things. And then the lesson that we had last week, where you were even kind of going through, you had me hooked up to everything. And you were like, oh, just kind of looking at your notes and looking at the tech, and you're like, okay, I think I see what you're doing here. You weren't even looking at me. You're like, I see what's going on here. And then you're like, okay, I got it. I figured out what it is. That was just fascinating to me that just by looking at the numbers and the data, you were able to kind of pick apart like what's going on in my golf swing. And here I am, somebody that I feel like I do a pretty good job of keeping in shape and staying mobile and doing all these things. But like to your point, it's the movement patterns that I've just built up over time that no matter how much I work on my mobility, we have to retrain those things too.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating. I mean, I think when we start to deal with things at that level again, I get some very interesting responses or feedback from people, especially if they haven't worked with me before. One of the things that, it's like, I tend not to watch people hit balls. It's almost, I don't know. It's almost, it keeps me away from rendering opinion, right?
Yeah.
And as much as I want to watch somebody swing and make a change, there's been too many times that I've looked at a golf swing and said, oh, this is the issue. And then I've looked at the underlying things and said, well, you weren't wrong that was an issue, but it's not happening because of the reason you think it's happening. Mm-hmm. And so again, it's not about just diagnosing what you see and what is going on. Everybody can see you're coming over the top. I mean, everybody, like, those are really obvious things. And over time, again, in the last 100 years in golf, all we've had is observation. So it's not surprising that we get so fixed on watching the swing and hitting balls and watching video. And I'm not saying those things aren't valuable, but there's other pieces of information that I think are more valuable. And quite frankly, when we're working with some of these technologies, I don't need somebody to hit a lot of balls. If I have somebody to hit 10, 15 balls and I get all those things assessed on data, if there's a certain level of consistency to that data, I don't need you to keep hitting balls. We have the structure, so then I can start to assess. And I think, from there, the conversation very quickly turns to movement and posture, and we start talking about these other things. And then an hour's gone by and we haven't hit another golf ball yet, right? And so while I understand that, people want to get better at golf, it doesn't always happen by standing on a driving range and beating balls. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think that's one of the least effective ways to make these changes, both from assessment as well as actually going ahead and again, whether it's managing or changing, I think it's a very ineffective environment to do that. And it does shock people when they see me go through the process, and I don't adhere to some of these traditional things. And they're used to, they're coming up and they're expecting I'm going to hit 100 balls at the lesson today, and they hit 10. and they leave going, well, this is the best lesson I've ever had. And then they start to realize, like, I didn't even hit balls, right? Or Casey didn't even watch me hit balls.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. He wasn't even looking at me.
That stuff. I mean, and again, it's like, there was a certain period of time when I was a little more self-conscious about these things, and I was trying to, kind of adhere to some of the more traditional things, because again, it can be jarring for people to come in and experience something that's that different. But I think I've just settled into that over time too. I think I've gained confidence in what I do, and I've certainly seen enough progress with the students I work with that it's like, okay, there's something to what I do, and I think that keeping people's brains away from the distraction of these old patterns at the beginning is more important than getting them ripping balls right away. And I need them to create associations with their body, not necessarily with a golf club and a golf ball first. So again, I think a lot of, I'm glad you've gotten to experience it, but yeah, a lot of people have that feedback, but it's new, it's different. It's not what it used to be. And I think that's okay. I think, I'm looking at things in a different way, and I'm learning things from people that I need to learn. And I think as long as that information's being gathered, then I think we're okay. And people settle into that over time.
I've had the fortune of sitting and watching a couple of the clients that we shared take a lesson from you, and then even my own personal experience. It was funny because we started working on a little drill, more of a movement drill, and you're like, all right, that's what I want. And I'm like, that doesn't feel anything like my golf swing. And you're like, yeah, that's the problem. And you hear so many people that are like, they're like, man, that feels weird. But then like, I'm able to see like what's going on from behind the scenes with the TrackMan numbers. And it's like, oh, your ball speed's up like 10 miles an hour. And even it feels weird to that person in the moment, because it's the first couple times they've done it, or first 10, 20 times they've done it. But you already start to see some of the changes just by changing some of these movement patterns. So then how do we go? How do you then take somebody, and I obviously know a little glimpse into this, but what's the next step then? So now you've got them, you've seen some of this data, you see what's going on, because you told me in our first session, you're like, all right, now here's where the real work begins, but it's not with a golf club in hand.
Yeah. So again, I would look at this process. I'll describe teaching and coaching movement like learning how to read. So 3 stages to learning movement. There is a building block stage, right? There's a formation of those building blocks, and then there's a performance stage. Learning how to read is a great analogy to this, because I think we can break it down pretty clearly. When you're learning how to read, stage 1 is your ABCs, okay? You need to understand the alphabet in order to begin to do anything in terms of forming words or sentences, okay? So if you don't understand the alphabet, I'm going to have a really hard time forming words and sentences with you, okay? And so the 3 stages of learning to read would be the alphabet at stage 1, and stage 2 is words and sentences. Stage 3 is writing an essay or a book, right? So somebody comes to me on the driving range and says, Casey, I need you to help me write a novel, right? That's what happens. You come up, and I need to perform. I need to hit it further. I need to hit it straighter. I've got a match next week. Teach me how to write the novel, okay? Well, as a golf coach, I look at that and say, okay, so I do the assessment on this person, okay? Well, what if I find out they only got 10 letters, okay? They only have 10 letters in their alphabet. So as a golf coach, if I'm going to learn to manage that, right, getting back to managing versus changing, if I'm going to manage that, what that looks like is I'm going to take those 10 letters and try to figure out how many words and sentences we can form with those 10 letters, and we're going to take as many of those words and sentences and do our best to write a book. Okay, now that book at the end of the day is limited. Naturally, It has to be.
Yeah.
Okay, but maybe that's what that person wants to do, because again, the process of managing those 10 letters is easier for that person for whatever reason than going back and acquiring new letters, okay? Somebody that wants to change something, right? You and I, okay, we're going to change this, okay? We're going to change this pattern. I need you to feel something new. Well, I need you to go back and learn the alphabet, okay? I need you to go back and fill in these letters that you don't know. And that may look like a drill where we're doing something, and I get you to feel something. I get you to feel an activation in the muscles, right? Now your brain and muscles have a different connection. I've got a new letter, okay? I need that letter because I need to, in the next stage, teach you how to now leverage that and plug it back in your golf swing, okay? And at that second stage, I can put a golf club back in your hand, right? Once you have the letter and you understand that, now we have something to work with. I can go back to stage 2 with you, put a golf club in your hand, and expect that you have some capacity now to use that letter. right? And then once you get good at that and you calibrate that, I can now expect you to go out into the wild on a golf course and perform and do so without having to think about that letter or that word or sentence, okay? But if you don't have that capacity, it's not going to happen, right? So somebody comes up to me and they want me to change, right? We're going to write this novel. Well, let's take a step back and bring some context to this, right? These are your letters. This is what we're dealing with, right? And that's where that conversation goes. We can either manage this or we can change it. And oftentimes in that stage one, right, when you're starting to do stage one work with somebody, if that person doesn't have some, and this is where, again, drawing athletic parallels, right? If this person has an athletic parallel that I can draw, I might be able to jump into stage two because they might already have that letter. They might not be using it, but they might have it, right? So that's part of that. Okay, you're a pitcher. Well, if you're a pitcher, then I know you have certain athletic qualities I can tap into, right? And so that becomes a part of that equation. But again, if you're not willing to go through those three stages, then we're not changing anything, right? And so with you, what we did, right, when we go back and we start to do those level one things, and yeah, it's like, okay, this doesn't feel anything like my golf swing. Perfect, okay?
Right.
I need to hear that, right? And
That's
I hear that.
letter, right?
I hear that from everybody. Now you've identified a new letter, okay? You've identified a new pattern that I need you to get good at in this environment before I expect that your brain is all of a sudden going to make it happen with a golf club in hand, right? Your brain has associated with it patterns. When you swing a golf club and you pick up a golf club, it says, all right, here are my 10 letters and here are my words and here I go. Okay, well, again, if I want you to have more than those 10 letters, right, I need to train that before I just expect all of a sudden it's going to magically happen. And so, yeah, going back and training at that level one stage and reintroducing patterns to people and teaching them at that base level how to engage muscles, how to do this properly. I mean, that's a really, really deep science. I mean, that's getting into Allison's world, right? Allison TG is phenomenal at this. The neuroplasticity side of training the brain to do something different. I mean, that is a really deep science. It's something that she has been involved with for years that nobody else has been involved with. So there are people like that out there that are good at this stuff. But again, if you don't understand the process of changing, then it's going to be a really difficult stage. And again, I think that framework is what drives everything. I don't care what athlete I'm working with, what sport I'm working with. This is the framework that you're going to be dealing with because this is how your brain works and this is how it learns. And if you don't want to play by those rules, you're going to have trouble. So that's why we do those things. And that's why those environments are important. It's why, I try to maintain 3 different teaching environments because they're different. And in a different environment, I need your brain in a different place. I need you focusing on different things because, again, that process of development looks different. And again, once somebody understands the context of those things, they're generally more willing to go through it. They're generally more focused and determined with it. It's when people are lost or people don't understand it and there's no context to what they're doing, I think people really start to struggle. But as long as you can provide the framework and context, like people will do the work.
Where do you see the balance between internal focus, external focus? Because there's a lot of talk about, well, one's better than the other, but there has to be a combination of both, I think, as far as, the ultimate result that you get on the golf course, what you're trying to do with your golf swing, with the golf ball. But obviously we're talking about a lot of things where you have to internally be able to feel something, focus on and understand what's going on. Where do you see that balance? And at one point do you utilize one more so than the other?
So again, I would go back and apply this to the 3 stages of development, right? And I think both are paramount because the process of building a pathway in the brain requires internal focus. But the process of performing requires external focus. So there's a period at which the development of a new pattern requires that internal focus. So in stage 1, right, when you're doing that type of work and I'm asking you to develop this new letter, that's all internal.
Yeah.
Okay, I need you to be internal because you're using a part of your brain that's going to build a neural pathway. That's what we associate as muscle memory, okay? The problem is internal focus will operate your brain at about 400 to 500 commands per second. External focus is around 3,000 to 4,000 commands per second. Those are really different things when we look at the athletic world. So somebody could be internally focused on the exact right things and moving the body in the exact perfect way. But if they're internal, that body is not going to perform at a high level, right? Mm-hmm. And we watch this on TrackMan, right? Yeah. We'll watch somebody hitting balls. They're hitting it great, but their speed's 5 miles an hour low.
Right.
Well, why? Well, because they're internally focused. The body's operating at a different capacity. And again, a certain amount of that work is necessary to build new letters. But again, you have to learn as an athlete the difference between internal and external, because if you're going out to perform and you're an internal focus, you're not going to like the way your body's athletically performing. I don't care if your thought process is perfect and your movement's perfect, you're not going to like the performance, because nothing feels good as an athlete internally. I think everybody can associate with that. They know what that feels like. Conversely, when we're in the zone, right, we get in that athletic zone, you're just driven by intention. You're not necessarily having to think your way through something. It just feels so good. Everything comes into play. But when you're externally focused like that, you're relying on those patterns. You're relying solely on those letters. So if you don't like your 10 letters, you're not going to like being external, because guess what? When you go externally focused, all you're going to be exhibited to are those 10 letters. So again, I think people get really lost in both the internal and external and where to apply that in those 3 stages of development. And I think if people can start to segment out their understanding of movement into those 3 stages and understand that stage 1 is internal, stage 3 is external, and stage 2 is where you learn how to convert internal to external.
Right.
That's the whole point of stage 2. The whole point of stage 2 in learning is to take this internal focus, like, okay, I can do this when I'm thinking about it now. Now I need to get my body to do this without thinking about it. And when I get to that stage, right, now I can go write a book, right? When I understand my words and my sentences and I don't have to think about that, it's a lot easier to go write a book, right?
Yeah.
But if I'm still in the stage where I have to learn how to spell words, well, now you're still between stages 1 and 2. You're not ready for stage 3. So again, I think it all comes down to that format and understanding that this is how the brain works. This is how it performs. And if you want to do one thing or another, you have to understand the context of that so that you can keep yourself in a place where, again, you're not beating your head against the wall trying to make progress with these things. Because you can be thinking about and trying to do the right things, but if you're not in the right environment, if you're not in the right mind space, it can be really challenging. And again, all of those pieces of context are what a coach is for. That's my job, right?
Right.
It's my job to create context and understanding in those environments. And that's why people don't hit a lot of golf balls early on, because we're having these conversations. We're getting all this stuff framework so that they understand what they're about to go through.
Is there ever a time where you're having somebody that's struggling with the internal piece or a certain movement pattern, where you then will rely on maybe bringing an external focus, and maybe we need to clarify what those really are. I don't know that if anybody doesn't know what the difference between internal and external focus is. But is there ever a time when maybe they're just struggling to get the internal focus piece of it, and so you take like an external focus drill that helps them kind of feel it a little differently, and then
For
bring
sure.
that back in?
I mean, there's always times where you're going to find somebody struggling mentally in one capacity or another, whether you're on the golf course and they're too internal, or you're in an environment where I need to get them internal and they're just external. So yeah, you want drills that you can rely on that immediately help remove people from that. I think the most important thing to understand about the internal versus external when it comes to that level is understanding that it has a lot to do with the environment and the instrument that you're handing this person. So if I'm seeing somebody with a golf club in their hand and they're getting really internal, right, I will remove the golf club from their hand and give them an instrument or a drill that allows them to continue to be internal. A lot of times people will get internal because of a lack of confidence, right? They can feel something's off and it's not right. So the instinct to go internal is good in a sense that they're trying to fix it. But again, you have to remove them from an environment where their expectation is performance.
Right.
Because again, if they're sitting there trying to hit balls and they're not seeing the ball fly right, now all of a sudden it's creating anxiety and we're implementing other parts of the brain. And so again, you have to be able to control that environment. You have to be able to see and know as a coach, now, number one, do I need them to be internal or external right now? And then how do I control that process? And once students start to learn both an understanding of and a recognition of when they're internal and external, and then how to meander between the two, well, that's when they really, really start to become self-sufficient. And I guess just to touch on internal versus external, when you look at a movement pattern, if we're looking at golf, for instance, right, an internal focus would be thinking about a part of the process of the swing. A external focus would be thinking about the result of the swing. So if I stood behind a ball and I'm visualizing a draw and I stood over the ball telling myself to hit a draw, that's an external focus. That's based on the result of the movement. I'm not thinking about the movement itself. An internal focus would be, okay, I need to flex my right elbow and deviate my left wrist and do all, those are all pieces of the swing. I need to put the club here. I need to do this with my knee, this with my hip. Those are all internal focuses. Those are all pieces of the process. So you're either thinking about the process or you're thinking about the results of the process. The results of the process are external. The process itself is internal.
So let's say somebody's coming in, even somebody like myself, just kind of started working on some of the body movement pieces, right? And I go out to play. How do I switch from trying to be so focused on, all the things that we're working on? And like you said, when you go out to the golf course, you want it to be on autopilot. Now, obviously, I don't have all the letters. I can't speak very coherent sentences yet, but going out there, I also don't want to be trying to think about every little move in my golf swing and then be pissed off when I blow it to the right or to the left, and all these inconsistencies come in. So what suggestions you have for somebody that might be going through some changes? They're ready to make those changes and work on the body, but then they have to go play and they have to perform in some way, shape, or form.
So this can get tough. And I think that, obviously in an ideal world, you're going to educate a student as to the difference between internal and external, give them some strategies, or, hey, when you start to feel yourself or find yourself thinking about this, right, you can go back to thinking about this. I implement a lot of drills that help with that process. So as soon as a student finds himself thinking on a golf course, we deviate them to a drill that allows them to immediately remove themselves from internal and get external. And so you're on a golf course, you're always better off being external, even with poor movement. So say you're better off reading a children's book than trying to read Shakespeare at that point. Be okay with the limitations of what you have. And I think that's really hard to accept for some people. Mm-hmm. But again, as a part of that initial process with somebody, you have to be able to give them realistic expectations. Hey, based on what you're doing, these are the things that you can expect right now. And I think when people go to the golf course with false expectations or this idea that, hey, I've solved all these problems, and then it deviates, that's when mentally they get into that spiral, right? And as soon as the anxiety kicks in, you're in fight or flight, and your brain's not working the way we want it anyway. So again, I think part of that is bringing context to the situation. If you know that you're making real change with a student, you have to be able to give them realistic expectations as to what that's going to be on the golf course. And initially, again, they either need to commit to being able to go on the golf course and mentally accept the fact that they're not going to necessarily see the changes they're working on right away, or they need to remove themselves from that. And that can be hard. But again, you get to know students that way, right? And I'm not a student who struggles mentally to remove themselves or toggle between internal and external. I'm not going to make changes with them in the middle of the season. I'm going to manage what they're doing in the middle of the season. Hey, when we get to the off season and you've got 2 or 3 months we're not going to play golf, all right, now let's dive into a little bit. Because now I know that I don't need to visit stage 3. I don't need to get you external for a really long time. Right. And so we can really get internal then, and all the practice and stuff can really get into the patterns. And once somebody really goes internal for a long period of time, you see a tremendous amount of change in that person's movement. But again, then after 2 or 3 months of being internal, you need to be able to flip the switch with them, and all of a sudden, hey, now I need you to stop thinking about everything we've been doing for 3 months. Well, why were we doing it? Because your body's going to run on autopilot now.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I think a lot of that is honesty. And I think as a coach, that's where we need to be able to communicate these things to people. And the more we understand about this, the more we can create realistic expectations. And then I don't think people freak out, right? I think once people know, it's like, hey, no, you're going to go to the golf course for this period of time, and I'm going to expect that you're going to see this. Hey, by the way, when you start hitting it left, that's a good thing. You need to come see me. We need to adjust the next piece, right? Because again, you see the changing in patterns, and you're taking slow steps when it's at that level, when you're trying to go through all 3 stages of development. And ultimately, again, I tell people the ultimate goal for people is to develop a level of independence, which is your ability to self-diagnose and properly feel what's going on and know what the proper courses of action are. Whether that be, hey, I'm feeling this on the golf course today, I need to go do this in practice, right? Or I'm feeling this on the golf course, this is what I do to manage it. All of those little strategies are what people develop over time with this process. And it develops this level of independence where, there isn't an anxiety when they see something occur on the golf course or something deviates. They know what's happening. They know how to deal with it. And so it just creates this confidence about themselves and about their game that I think, when I look at golfers specifically, that's my goal for everybody, is to develop that independence.
Well, this speaks to the importance of why the off season can be so beneficial for people, right? We see way too many people that come in now February, March, April, and they're like, all right, got to get tuned up for the season. It's like, well, had you come and started 2 months ago, we could have been doing all this stuff. And like you said, you prefer to have them indoors, not out there hitting balls and working on all that stuff, because there's not that performance piece. So you can go and work on these movement patterns. So all of a sudden, hopefully, when you get back out there, it becomes a little bit more on autopilot. And we have to keep like ringing that bell, like, hey, the off season is a super important time. Whether you're getting in the gym or whatever it is, like you're tuning up your body and you can come out. So we were just talking to a client that we both work with, and he just came in today and he's like, man, he has access to hitting indoors, but he's also putting in the work here, right?
Right.
And he's like, man, I'm striping it. And he went down and played in Dallas. He's like, I'm killing it off the tee. I'm playing so much better than I have in the past season. It's like, well, yeah, you put in all this time
right
in between.
And that's what I mean, the best situation is somebody like this who comes to us who is an athlete, who's motivated to do work, but he works out 5 days a week already.
Yeah.
Right? Like, okay, well, this is easy. I mean, that now you just need to follow directions, right? At this point, like, all I need you to do is just follow directions. And so, you know, when somebody's willing to put in that work, it's like, okay, well, now it's just about education. It's about making sure that the work he's putting in is efficient. Mm-hmm. That the time he's spending in the gym with somebody like you is addressing the same things that I'm trying to address. And again, now you're starting to address these issues from multiple areas, right? Now, all of a sudden, you're building these patterns and these letters in all these different environments. Now I've got a completely different capacity for change and for growth. And this is somebody that, again, we've seen make smaller increments of change over a longer period of time. And we can just continue to move in that direction with him because, again, you have such an opportunity to affect the baseline patterns. He's working out, which is where we're able to continue to build and reinforce ABCs, right? He's continuing to do the work in level 1 for me where he's hitting balls, right? He's learning how to transfer that stuff over. And now he's understanding this last piece, which is when I go to the golf course, what's my mindset? How do I get all the things that I've been training to come out on a golf course? And that's what we're starting to see with him is it's like now all of a sudden we've gained efficiency in level 1 and 2 of development. Now we can see the transition to level 3. And it's really cool to see somebody go out there and have so much change. And I mean, he was a very high level player to begin with. But it also speaks to the fact, I mean, it doesn't matter if we're dealing with a beginner or a PGA Tour player. There are inefficiencies with all of us, and they can be addressed. And, you know, we can plug anybody into this system. And it's part of, you know, it's part of what's so much fun about it is being able to see somebody that's already willing to put the time and effort in, but, you know, just hasn't seen the gain or growth just because they've lacked context. It's lack of context in the assessment. It's a lack of context in training. And when you address those things get better. Yeah.
And even with, like you said, very high-level golfer. So think about the person that is not a high-level golfer that comes in, doesn't have a whole lot of letters in their capacity, and to start putting some of that, they're going to see even more. It's like somebody trying to lose weight right out of the gate that has a lot of weight to lose. They're going to see a lot right at the beginning, right?
Absolutely.
And so somebody like this in particular client, he's already got a pretty high IQ when it comes to golf, and to be able to tweak some of those things is pretty impressive to see. Let's talk about just how to blend a little bit of the golf instruction and the fitness side of things, because there's so many different so much different information out there about, you know, what golf fitness is, how do you relay what you're doing on the lesson tee, in the gym, what's the crossover? I mean, obviously I come from a position of my goal is to make the body move very well, to get a person stronger, make sure they have some speed. It's not necessarily to ingrain, you know, it's not to look at their golf swing and try to fix their movement patterns, right? I'm here to make sure that all of their pieces move well so that when they do come and see you, they have an awareness, they have proprioception of their body, and they can do the things that you're then trying to do. So how do you see that blending together?
Yeah, in an ideal world, somebody like yourself is my level 1. Okay, so if I'm assessing an athlete and say this guy needs his ABCs, right? Well, I can send him to Jeff, and Jeff will teach him his ABCs, right? It doesn't mean that I can't, but it's also not specifically my lane, right? I can definitely dabble in that stuff. I can definitely do that stuff. But again, somebody like yourself with the experience in that environment is going to be great, right? And now all of a sudden, if I can get somebody working out and taking care of all that stuff, it's a more seamless way to get them to do that work, number one. But at the same time, it's extremely meaningful because now they have a completely different capacity when they come to see me. Right now, all of a sudden, hey, you've got these letters I can work with. So from that standpoint, yeah, I think it's really important that people find that crossover, but it's really incumbent on the coach, right? So if I'm the performance coach, right, it's important that the performance coach is able to correctly identify what this student needs, right? So going back to the assessment side of things, right? When I look at the assessment, this isn't my opinion anymore. This player needs more activation of this muscle at this time. So when the body's moving in this plane of motion, I need this muscle activated. Now that's something really specific. I go to you. Say, hey, when this person's moving in the frontal plane, I need more oblique. Okay, right? Now it's that I'm going to toss that task over to you. I could try to figure that stuff out and I can work with that, right? But somebody like yourself is going to be much more efficient with doing that. And so if I can communicate those things adequately, say this person needs more balance in the frontal plane, this person needs more rotation in the right hip, right? Those little things for you allow you to be more surgical in what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so I think it's important, for people that, maybe working with a trainer and working with a golf coach and these people aren't communicating, right? It's important that there's some sort of tie over there, because now you're just hoping that the things you're doing with your trainer are crossing over to the things you're doing with your performance coach. And it's not always that we see, the deficits that a person will exhibit in the gym is the same deficits that they'll see on the golf course. It does work that way, but sometimes that person that shows deficits on the golf course doesn't show that deficit in the gym. And so that trainer is not necessarily going to address this in the same way. Or if I go to the trainer and say, hey, I need this person to be better at this specific movement, I need them to engage this specific muscle, right? And we're getting really specific, right? And when I look at the golf swing, again, background in kinesiology and biomechanics allows me to understand more about muscle activation, about what governs movement. And so, again, if I need to see more force in a certain direction, okay, well, I need this muscle to be more engaged. And so that's, again, something that I'm going to go back to you and say, I need this person to get better at turning on this particular muscle group. And so you're going to work on that proprioception and the strength and all that stuff associated with that. That person comes back to me, there's a new letter for me to work with. So that's an ideal world. That is best case scenario, is that the performance coach you're working with can assess you to a level that meaningfully can transition into these other parts of life. And I think that's best case scenario when you're talking fitness and performance.
And we've actually seen that where, like a couple guys that I've been working with for a while, and then we were able to get them to come and see you, and you were able to pinpoint a couple things. It's like, well, we've been doing, their training sessions, and they've been coming in and putting in the work, but you were able to identify a couple things like, hey, we need him to feel this or be more balanced here. And so then we're able to put a couple of those little drills into their training program. Not a huge overhaul. We still do a lot of the same stuff that we're working on with, their strength and upper body, lower body, and rotation and everything. But now it's like, okay, we have another little tool in our toolbox of where we need to kind of pinpoint. And that's been super helpful. One last question before we get into our last little kind of rapid fire round. With 3D, obviously you're an expert in the 3D technology. Obviously we've been kind of privy to 2D for so long. We watch guys on TV, guys and girls on TV. We're constantly looking at videos, and golfers tend to watch and try to mimic what's going on. What are maybe a couple pieces of the swing that in 2D we've just kind of gotten wrong, where now that we have 3D and we're able to look at it from all different angles of what the body's actually doing, that, maybe I think that a lot of us are very good at trying to do what we think we're trying to do, but we're not trying to do the right thing.
Sure. I think vectorizing 2D to 3D is pretty dangerous in the sense of gleaming accurate information. I will say the databases that exist are helping bridge those gaps, right? So there's a lot of the companies out there now that are writing some of these deep algorithms that will disseminate some more accurate information. I would say for a long time we just completely were not getting it right. There's so much that goes on with 2D in terms of poor referencing. I mean, if the camera angle is a couple degrees off, you're technically looking at a different reference point. So you're not seeing the movement accurately depicted, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times what you think you're seeing may be another movement pattern that disguises itself as hip rotation, for instance. So how you define, the rotation of the hip joint versus the general rotation of the pelvis. I mean, there's some really deep level stuff that you start to look at. I would say if we were going to generalize this conversation, I would say 2D tells us pretty accurately what's going on. Okay, we can see large characteristics. I can see over the top movements, right? We can see a lot of this stuff that happens with a golf club, for instance. And if we're going to just assume that we're using the proper camera angles and all these things and we're gathering accurate data, I would still say you're gathering information on what happened, not why it happened. And so in the best environment, if we're going to remove the conversation of 2D isn't accurate because of all these reference points, if we just assume that it is accurate because you're creating proper reference points, I would then say that you're still looking at what happened, not why it happened. And although, again, like flight scope and TrackMan, right, that's what happened. That's like another information about what happened. I don't think it's unimportant to know what happened, but I think it's more important to understand why all these things occur. And when you're looking at 3D, you're measuring forces, you're measuring direction of force. That is something that you cannot take from a 2D unit. There's not a way to accurately do that. And as much as we have seen companies try to do that sort of thing, I mean, I've seen companies work at this for years and years and put millions of dollars into camera systems that ultimately in 5 minutes we can poke holes in all these things with 3D and say you're not accurately depicting what's happening. I think it gets back to that very simple thing. Are you assessing what's going on or why it's going on? And I think if you really want to coach people at a deep level and understand this type of stuff, you need to start to understand why things are happening, not just what's happening.
I think we could go another couple hours, a couple more rabbit holes.
There's a lot to talk about here.
There is, and I've got several other things that I'd love to do. We're going to do this again, absolutely. But let's finish up with the questions we ask everybody that comes on the show. Have a little fun here at the end. First of all, Happy Gilmore or Caddyshack? You being a hockey guy, I'm a little curious to hear your answer.
I gotta go. That's really hard. Caddyshack.
All right. If you could pick a walk-up song to the first tee box, what are you picking?
Walk-up song to the first tee box. Oh boy. Jeez, I don't know.
Let's say walk-up song to the first tee box at the Phoenix Open. Let's put a little context around it.
Welcome to the jungle.
Okay.
Get the party started.
If you could play golf, you could spend basically 4 or 5 hours with your dream foursome. So 3 other people, could be anybody in the history of the world. Who are you picking to spend 3 hours with?
My dad, it would be Tiger Woods and Arnold Palmer.
Nice. If we had the 18-strong G4 jet fueled up, ready to go, what bucket list course are you going to today?
Well, today we're going to Augusta National. I would say if we could do it at any time, though, we'd be going to the St. Andrews just before the Open.
Okay.
I don't want to play St. Andrews in the normal condition. I want to play it in open condition.
I love it.
There's my caveat.
All right. Is there a book that you like to recommend to people, that you would recommend to the audience? And this could be golf-related, hockey-related, biomechanics-related, or completely unrelated to anything that we talked about today. It's something that's impacted you that you like to recommend to people.
Oh, there's so many. Boy, there's so many. I think the concept behind Golf's Not a Game of Perfect is awesome. Steve Yellen also has some really good books on simplicity. One of his books is called Simplicity. I think understanding, I think those things, again, I would look at things that provide context in the general senses like we talked about, right? Like, how does your brain learn? Mm-hmm. And when somebody understands more about those learning process and, hey, these are the stages of development, I mean, you can do anything you want now. And you apply that to any type of concept. So I think I would go along those lines, so.
What's the best piece of golf advice that you've ever been given?
The best piece of golf advice I've ever been given. Well, I mean, you come back to something simple as golf's not a game of perfect. I think that type of concept is really important. On a performance side, I would lean towards, even some of those things that TPI believes in, that, assessing an athlete allows you to do surgery with a scalpel, not a hacksaw. These are underlying principles that I believe deeply in. In terms of golf information I've been given, funny story. When I was starting to play golf, and I worked at a golf course before I played golf. And in my freshman year, I went to private school. You had to play 3 seasons of sports. And so I was trying to figure out what I was going to do fall of my freshman year. And a golf coach got a hold of me and says, "Hey, you play hockey, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, coming out for the golf team, okay?" So I show up first day of golf practice. I've got my dad's clubs. I don't even have clubs, all right? I got my dad's graphite clubs. And I'm standing up there just ripping drivers, right? And they are going all over the planet, as you can imagine. I'm not a golfer. The golf coach walks over and he's watching me hit balls for a couple minutes, takes all the woods out of my bag, puts them in the trunk of his car, and he says, "You're going to learn how to play your irons first." I played my entire high school golf career with irons only.
The whole thing?
Whole entire career with irons only.
Never took a driver, never took
Never
a
hit
wood.
a single drive in my high school career.
Did he give them back?
At the end of my high school career. But it was situational in the sense. I mean, our golf coach was our Latin teacher, so he wasn't a golf tech guy. But back in the day, the context of that taught me that as much as power and all these things are important, control was golf is a game of control. And as much as we train athletes for power now and all this stuff, at the end of the day, I get them back into that performance sense, and it's all about control.
Yeah.
So, it taught me that control was more important. And I think, that's probably the best thing that ever happened to me for golf.
I love it. Where can people find more about you, your institute?
Yeah,
everything you're doing.
So sportsciencesolutions.us is our website. We've got a bunch of info on there. sportsciencesolutions@gmail.com is our email, and it's the easiest way to get a hold of us. But it's a never-ending rabbit hole if you're gonna get into the institute. So.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to come on. Obviously, you and I are working pretty closely together. And you're working on this project right here, teaching me some letters, which I need to get out and do my homework before the end of the day here. But can't thank you enough for coming on the show. It was an honor to have you on.
No, man, appreciate you having us. This is it's been a lot of fun, and we'll definitely we'll do it.
Awesome. All right, guys, if you want any more information on this episode, go to 18strong.com. You'll find all the links in the show notes, and we'll see you again next week.